You're listening to Rstories, a storytelling podcast that elevates the lived experiences of Chicago's migrant and refugee communities. I'm Chris Hsu, and along with my co-host Ali Toro, we'll share candid conversations with the inspiring individuals and advocates at the forefront of key issues affecting these communities, and we'll have plenty of fun along the way. Let's get started.
Welcome to Rstories. I am Ali Toro, along with my co-host Chris Hsu, and we are hosting Dr. John Slocum, the Executive Director of Refugee Council USA. Very, very welcome, Dr. Slocum.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Our pleasure. And so for the beginning, let's talk about a little bit your background and why are you working for refugees and immigrants in this country?
Let me start out by talking a little bit about what Refugee Council USA is, and I'll be using RCUSA as an abbreviation. But basically, we're a national membership association of national nonprofits that advocate for and serve refugees and other forcibly displaced people. So we have 41 member organizations. Those include all 10 of the national resettlement agencies that contract with the State Department for the initial reception and placement of refugees under the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, but also 31 other organizations, large and small, who work on related topics and related populations. So it's not just about resettlement; it also includes asylum seekers, asylees, stateless persons, torture victims, and other populations who've been forcibly displaced and come to the United States. Our organization has been around for about 25 years from its first informal origins, but we only became a registered 501c3 a couple of years ago. And we've had tremendous growth in the last 3 years, about 50% membership growth. So we're on an upswing. I think one of the key things about RCUSA is that we know that refugees are a subset of a broader set of broader categories of newcomer populations that include immigrants, include folks entering the U.S. under humanitarian parole, of which there have been large recent arrivals, including the Afghans and the Ukrainians who've come in the past few years. And so it's becoming a very complicated picture, and we in our advocacy, we want to be sure we're aligned with the broader immigrant rights movement, particularly at a time like this in our country's history when immigration writ large has become such a controversial topic. You asked about my own background, and I came relatively late in my career to refugee issues. I've been working on migration issues in a broad sense for more than 20 years. But I began as a political scientist. I have a PhD in poli-sci, and I taught for a few years. I was at the University of Oklahoma. And then I came to work for the MacArthur Foundation here in Chicago, where we're recording. And I was with MacArthur for 18 years, initially as a Russia specialist. And then I transitioned over time into funding on migration issues, but global migration, including some forced displacement issues. But basically, after leaving MacArthur, after a couple of years, I joined the board of directors of RCUSA and came in as executive director at first in an interim role, but then as the permanent ED. But I've been in the position about 3.5 years now. Came in on Inauguration Day or the day after Inauguration Day as my predecessor left to join the Biden administration.
Beautiful. You know what I love about you, that it's your educational background, political science. Chris, probably you should know, I love political science. I dropped out of high school when I was 17 because I didn't want to go to school at all. I thought, okay, my family were from middle class families. Okay, we were always, financially on and off. And I thought, okay, I need to go work. And money is the most important thing. But after 3 years in Iran, you have to pick your major in high school. I was in math. Okay, my major was math. But after 3 years, I learned about myself and my passion and what I want to change, my activities. and I became familiar with political science major. And after 3 years, I passed the qualification exam for the university, and I picked only political science. I had a choice to, pick 7 different universities and different majors. I picked, 7 just political science. And when I arrived here, I didn't browse, my other options. The first thing I applied for political science. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much for your background. But one thing I really want to hear from you, okay, I'm always impressed by someone like you or Chris. Okay, that you don't have lived experience, you didn't arrive in this country, but um, beyond your professional career or your career goals, okay, what is that behind your head or your heart, lead you towards to this field, supporting refugees and immigrants, and your level, not only providing services, and it's not only a job, also advocating for them. Advocacy, I believe, is not a job. Advocacy is a mission.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question, and it requires me to get a little autobiographical, right? So I have, my own ancestry includes, generations of folks who've been in the United States and even before it became the United States in terms of immigrant ancestors. My wife, however, on her mother's side, her grandparents were Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria. It came in the late 1930s. So I've been in close quarters with folks who have experienced a refugee situation, or at least their parents and grandparents did. But in my own case, I think it's been a gradual accumulation of factors that's brought me into this space. One of them is when I was a young poli-sci professor at the University of Oklahoma in the early 1990s, I was called in to do some expert witness work pro bono from the local Catholic charities, and these were for deportation cases in immigration court in Oklahoma City. And because I had a Russia expertise, I was called in to talk about conditions in the former Soviet Union, particularly for ethnic minority groups in different circumstances. There were 3 instances over a period of maybe as many years where I was called upon to do this. All 3 of the cases were successful, so they were able to stay in the United States. And that made me feel very good. But what made me feel less good is I would leave the hearing room and go into the waiting room and see people who were from Latin America who may well have had just as valid a claim for asylum, who did not have, a poli-sci professor there to speak on their behalf, may or may not have had representation at all. And so I realized that there's a lot of injustice just in the way the system operates. That's maybe the most impersonal motivation. More personally, many of my friends over the years have been immigrants, some of whom forced migrants who came to the country under various pathways. But then most personally, my mother, whom I lost at a fairly young age, had been a teacher she was trained to be a teacher of English as a second language. And I think she always had she brought the spirit of xenophilia into the household and into the family. I don't think it originated with her, but I remember as a little kid, she had a French pen pal, and she arranged for us to be host families, not in a formal refugee sponsorship sense, but just for foreign graduate students who were coming to the University of Illinois. We lived in Champaign, Illinois. And there were 2 such couples, and one, my father, who's still living, is still in touch with after 50 years, a family from Taiwan. And I my mom started a family and did not continue with a teaching career. I think she would have liked to return to it if she would have had the chance to do so eventually. But I recently found her grading book in a box of just old things in our basement. And I was under the impression, well, she'd gotten her master's and she maybe TA'd a little bit. She taught for 3 years. And when I looked at the list of names of the students she taught, first of all, she was a tough grader. I think we've had a lot of grade inflation since the 1950s. But when I looked at the list of the names in this book, it just gave me chills because it represented individuals who clearly came from all over the world, and this is back in the mid-late 1950s. And so I feel, in a real deep emotional sense, that I'm able to carry on work that she began, more than 60 years ago in my own profession. So,
yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And John, I want to build on something that I walked away from really motivated, and this is about the advocacy days, and love to hear you talk more about that as well, because it's a beautiful event that RCUSA hosts. But you talked in one of the closing remarks at this year's advocacy days and spoke to the growth, your own personal journey of becoming or just becoming aware of what being a bystander is, to becoming an ally, and how we journey that. And I think it takes one, I applaud your humility for approaching it, but two, your commitment to learning and growing. And speaking personally, I think that's a journey I find myself on, of recognizing the areas that I've been maybe a little too passive in ways in which I've been able to grow and learn to be an ally. So I'd love, if you don't mind, just speaking a little bit more of your journey there and how you've sort of grown along the way.
Well, thanks for that. And I don't know if we'll talk more about the Advocacy Days event, but I can say a few words about it now, if that's all right. This is something that RCUSA and our member organizations do each year, and that is to bring constituents from around the country to Washington to speak with congressional offices and to the extent possible to the members of Congress themselves, senators as well as representatives, about the need to continue to support refugee resettlement and other programs designed to help forcibly displaced people. This event, a lot of advocacy organizations do this kind of work. RCUSA is by no means unique, not even among our own coalition, not by a long shot. But what's become very special about this event, which only really began in its current form, as I understand it, in 2019, before I came to the organization, is that it has, over the years, become an event that really centers the what we call FDPs, forcibly displaced people themselves, the former refugees. I think it began as, okay, let's bring constituents from around the country, and it would be nice if there were former refugees among them. And now that's completely flipped. We had somewhere in the vicinity of 220, 230 people that came to Washington at the beginning of May this year, and 174 of those registrants were former refugees. And not just former refugees, former asylum seekers, asylees, humanitarian parolees, just, again, the range of populations that I talked about at the outset. And what they do, they're able to come in and speak to their member of Congress or to the lead staff folks in that congressional office and tell their stories. And not just their stories, because we don't want to walk with refugees just so we can drag them in and have them tell us a story, which may or may not, end up, triggering trauma for them. We want to showcase them, first of all, for their successes, for their expertise. We've gone from talking about lived experience to lived expertise. And many of the former refugees that come for this Advocacy Days events are now not only successful in their work lives and in their educational achievement and so forth, but working in our field or something similar to our field. In other words, they're professional advocates and they're professional service providers, and I think that's a sign of a maturing field. We're certainly not the only social policy arena where where centering lived experience has become a priority, but I'm proud of the degree to which that's becoming the case, and also very much recognize how far there is to go. You talked about I've strayed from the question, and so you talked about like one's journey from becoming a bystander, and I think for me, it's moving from the abstract to the concrete, because I did start out as an academic, and I'll take an academic worldview as my sort of default. I did not come as someone who is from a social service background. And if it were not for the people that do have that experience, I couldn't do the work that I do. I'm in a leadership position within the organization. I have to sort of have an eye on all aspects of what we do. But we have among our staff and certainly across our membership folks who've just brought me along and helped me better understand the realities of being a refugee, of working with refugees, and of advocating for them. I know there was more to your question, but I can't remember it now, and I can't remember what I was going to say in response to the initial question before I talked about advocacy.
No, we'll circle back to it, because I think I would like to follow up on a couple of things. Thank you for the sort of picture of the advocacy days, because it is remarkable. It was my first time going this year, and we'll have a contingent going next year, right. Which is wonderful. But I think you hit on something that is too frequently minimized or flat out ignored, is sort of a tokenization of lived experience, and that is problematic, and we understand why, and the lack of recognition of expertise.
Yeah.
And I applaud you and others for spotlighting leadership development, and there's a whole day focused on leadership development for folks with lived experience, and not as a, hey, you need to be better leaders, but recognize that you're swimming into waters that don't even see you. And one thing you said in an early episode, and I'll land it with my question, is you felt like an invisible man for a long time,
right,
in the country, and there's this just oppression, and it's sad. And I think when you become more and more aware of it, you can't help but be really motivated to address it. So I'm curious if you could give like advice. I mean, we work in the social service space, but there will be folks listening to this that work in all industries, not-for-profit and for-profit. Of what does it mean, like lived expertise, and how do you give someone the courage? And that's a weird way to frame the question, but say, hey, trust me on this. It's more than you can check a box, which is really tragic, and it is so much more than that. It's so much more enriching, and you'll find yourself incredibly privileged just to walk alongside folks, and to find yourself in awe. So how do you approach that?
I've had some great mentors, and I want to talk about some advice I got from one mentor who's sadly has since passed away, but I started working with maybe 20, 25 years ago. And he said two things that stuck with me. Again, this is going to be a little bit roundabout, but I hope it gets to your hope it gets to your question. And the first thing he said, well, this work should be fun. You know, and at the time I was working for a philanthropic foundation, and when you actually get to give away money and don't have to spend your time trying to raise it, believe me, you've got some troubles that are not on your desk that should make that work fun. But I think it applies more broadly. I think we should enjoy what we're doing. And it's easy to lose sight of that in the stresses of any work environment. But I feel very fortunate to be doing work that I genuinely enjoy. And I think I don't think people would, particularly those who are sort of frontline service providers, I don't think they would be doing it if they didn't have, in addition to sort of a mission-driven set of motivations, if they didn't enjoy it. It's like traveling abroad. When you travel abroad, you can be a tourist, and sometimes that's what you're there to do, is see the sights, or you can meet with people and try to experience what you're seeing through their eyes and their experiences, and ideally through their language. And when I've had the latter kind of experiences, that's what's drawn me closer. And probably, I hope, made me a little more sensitive to the circumstances of people who may feel invisible in this country because their English is imperfect, because they don't share, they didn't spend the previous 3 decades of their lives watching American television or being immersed in other aspects of pop culture. And I think just having the sensitivity to not sprinkle your speech with like American football metaphors, or references to 1980s pop culture that are going to sail right past the heads. Well, the latter sail past the heads of folks that are younger than me. But you were a stranger, and everyone's been a stranger, and knowing what it's like to be a stranger is part of the necessary empathy. So have fun. But the other piece of advice, to go back to my dear old mentor, the other piece of advice was, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't feel the need to take credit for it. And I'm just as happy as the next person to take credit for success when it comes. But when you begin with that attitude, and particularly working in coalition and partnership, as we all have to do all the time in this increasingly sort of complex and we're not staying within organizational silos and even professional silos or sector silos in this day and age. When you have to work in coalition and in partnerships and on cross-sector initiatives and so forth, keeping your eye on the prize, which is not your own personal success or the success of your institution narrowly, but the mission. I have found time and again that advice really rings true. You can accomplish great things. Don't go into it with the notion of taking credit for them, but of getting it done and doing what it takes to get it across the finish line. I worry that getting it across the finish line may be one of those sports metaphors as well, but I think it's probably universal.
Hey, the Olympics are coming up.
Exactly.
So the Olympics are coming up.
John, thank you so much. I want to reiterate your point that, I believe anybody who works in this field for refugees and immigrants, nonprofits, social service providers, we are not here only to build our resume or, of course, income matters. Okay, our salary is important. However, I believe anybody who works in our field, they have a certain level of passion, and they are the mission driven, and they really dedicate themselves to the population, from line staff to the leadership position. That's why personally, anytime when and I've been working for nonprofits forever in this country, even in my country, then I cannot stand certain people who I feel are there only to make salary or build a resume, or they are not for the mission. So it's hard, But I've seen some people that's why those certain people they last less and less enough in this in this type of organization. But yeah, I believe all of us are there for the mission first, and it's part of our duty. Then and other things, I'm wearing my refugee hat now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not
Okay.
going to challenge you,
All right.
but it's for our audience. So a couple of them you mentioned former refugees. It's true on paper. We are former refugees. Now I got my blue passport. I voted for, as soon as I could vote, and I'm actively trying to participate, in my civic duty. But on paper, I'm a refugee. I'm a former refugee. In my reality, I can assure you, not only me, all my fellows who arrive here as a refugee, we are still a refugee.
Yeah.
Okay, challenges, we are facing. Let me give an example. For example, I want to grow. I want to climb the ladder in my career.
Mm.
So any higher level position, I believe, not feel. Okay, I'm very competent. I can get those positions. Okay, when I submit my resume, okay, the first thing, if they call me, the first thing, hey, you don't have enough experience. So how I can gain that? Well, we need, for example, 8 years leadership experience and then 7 years supervisor experience. So if I have to explain how I arrived here, okay, I did in my country many things, okay, I know nobody considered that gap, or nobody really can pay attention to my skills and my knowledge and my education. So, you know, I came around with my reality. Okay, that's why I feel every day I'm in a battlefield to climb the ladder, and I have a beautiful life here. I built my family. I have a lovely wife, lovely daughter. Okay, you know them. Then, but when when I go back to my reality every day, I realize so many barriers are in front of me. Okay, and that's why I always appreciated, so many people like you, like Chris, because you are always there to remove these barriers in front of us, okay, who arrived here as a refugee. Yeah, again, on the paper we are former refugees, but who are listening to us, trust me, the refugee status stay with us until we die. So my question now for you is, based on your expertise, and use your political science knowledge as well. So, what is the biggest systemic challenges, barriers in front of refugees in this country?
Well, first of all, in terms of whether you experience your identity as a refugee rather than a former refugee, it is certainly not up to me to dictate, that label. And anytime we in our field choose one of those word labels, we have to be super cognizant of the fact. And I've been in more than one room where that exact issue is being debated among refugees themselves, right? So, the terminology, part of it is provided by the law, but the terminology should be applied in ways that come from lived expertise. I have trouble answering that question because I think in some ways you're better placed to answer it than I am. I mean, we did. RCUSA was a partner in a project to do a survey, or basically to develop a survey instrument on refugee integration self-assessment. And I'm going to refer to my notes for some of what the top challenges were that were pointed out. First were jobs that lead to long-term growth and satisfaction, and the way the refugee admission system is set up, early self-sufficiency, early economic self-sufficiency is number one. I don't need to tell you all that.
Just say it louder, please.
And what does that imply for the ability to find a satisfying career ladder, to get the retraining or the recertifications, the skilling? Again, I defer to those who do this work professionally, but we understand that early economic self-sufficiency is woefully inadequate as a criterion for successful integration. And that's why we went and this project was co-designed by refugees, and it's now being field tested as a survey, actually here in the Chicago area by World Relief Chicagoland. They're about to go into the field, I think, probably by the time this podcast comes out. And but it's obviously not just employment. It's obviously housing, which is a huge challenge. And I'll get back to that challenge in a minute because we've spent a lot of time on that at RCUSA in recent months. I think mental health, and I know that Trellis has a robust behavioral health program. I was at a conference recently where they actually showed brain scans of people before and after a significant level of sort of trauma-informed care and mental health interventions. And if we ignore or underplay the significance of mental health and trauma for populations that have, by definition, have experienced it, then we're going to be behind the curve in everything else that we want to see in terms of success for those populations, for those people. And just one more gap that I'll point out that RCUSA is beginning to address, and that's gender-based violence. One of our staff members, Emily Wood, led an effort. It was approved by our board of directors, and really a couple of our resettlement agency partners had been motive forces as well, to set up a gender-based violence working group. This was launched just this past spring, and I'm educating myself on the topic. But the basic issue is that a lot of the funders who look at refugees and gender-based violence are looking at what happens to women and others prior to coming to the United States, and not what is the continued need for GBV-informed care once they're in the country. And there are some policy moves that need to happen, but there's also a lot of programming and sort of cross-learning among service providers that needs to happen. And so I'm just starting my own learning journey on that topic as it pertains to refugees. But I think those are some of the gaps. I said I wanted to go back to housing, though, and this to me leads to the sort of broadest possible question: what makes it hard for refugees to succeed in this country is a special case of what makes it hard for others to succeed in this country, and that is having, frankly, an economic system which, in the extremes of inequality that we tolerate, is stacked against folks at the lower ends of the economic spectrum. Life chances are, systemically different, among categories who've become racialized in the United States. And so unless we address the fact that we're nationwide facing a housing shortage, we're not going to resolve the housing problems faced by refugees who come in, with, you talked about an employment barrier, but a housing barrier. Obviously you don't have a previous landlord to vouch for you. You don't have a work record in this country and a credit history, and that makes it hard to obtain housing. So there's a lot of efforts across our field, to try to address that problem, but it's become very acute in the past years.
It's true, John. It's interesting when I started, writing my dissertation. Prior to that, I had two major issues I wanted to work on it. One, employment. The second was housing. I was more interested in studying housing issues, and I talked to different, resettlement agencies leaders, and I told them, "Hey, I'm going to work on housing. What do you think?" And I can tell you, Chris, all of them, I told them, "Do not touch housing." And I said, "No, I'm going to talk. I'm going to write work on housing." And again, the shocking thing that I realized there is not that much studies about housing, refugees housing.
Mm.
Then I thought, okay, I with my capacity, probably I won't get anywhere if I touch housing. That's why I picked employment barriers for my dissertation. And other
Mm.
point, another key you mentioned, the mental health. It's true, but for our audience, I can assure you, majority of refugees who arrive here, they arrive here with severe trauma. Okay, and personally, we had a staff meeting 2 3 months ago, and when I was talking to our new staff, I realized that for the first time uh, in my life in this country, I got a chance to take care of my mental health last year. I started a therapy session. Okay, so because in 10 years, 11 years, I was just forced to go and work immediately. The self-sufficiency in 90 days. I need to explain what does that mean. Then just fighting for my life, until 10 years I reached that point. I said, no,
Mm.
I need support, more support. And I got the chance. So many refugees, they don't have this chance to take care of their mental health. For our audience, when I'm talking about severe trauma, it's not like people leave their countries to seek better life. Okay, we are leaving our country to seek safety. For example, when I was a case manager, I had so many clients. One of them was very, their story was very sad. Single mom with 4 kids, and the husband, or the kids' dad, was beheaded in front of them. And then we brought him. The mom was employable, and we were forcing, and the kids were, school age, and we were forcing the mom to go to work as soon as possible. While that person, the kid, and the children were not ready at all, mentally.
Mm.
So for our audience, when we talk about economically self-sufficiency, or you should know that people have a wrong picture of refugees benefits in this country. They think, okay, refugees receive free benefits. Okay, they do, they receive free cash. It's not like that. So each refugee has only 90 days support from the government, federal government. And within 90 days, they must get a job. As soon as they get the job, they call it, they are self-sufficient now. So just think about it. If you are listening to this podcast, you have to force United States, become a refugee somewhere else. You don't speak the language. You are not familiar with the culture. You don't have any relative or support. Then the system tells you, hey, you have to go work. Okay, within 90 days is nothing. So majority of refugees, they start working within 90 days, and the system calls it self-sufficiency. Yeah.
And,
Mm.
and I want to, John, just really quick on the work that RCUSA has done that highlights those 4 major domains. Is that available? People can access, or
Our report is available online, called Integration Outcomes for Forcibly Displaced Persons, and in parentheses, FDPs, a holistic co-design approach. So integration outcome for forcibly displaced persons, if you Google it, there's a PDF online.
Great.
And you can see that report, which we've had a chance to present in various venues. And as I say, it's led to a survey that's now going into the field. And we're not the only entity that's doing this kind of work. We had partners in this project, starting with Refugee Congress, a refugee-led organization and a close partner, member of our coalition, the Ethiopian Community Development Council, and most recently the World Relief and World Relief Chicagoland. So, since we're an umbrella association, we always work in partnership whenever we can, and so that's where some of these findings about what did refugees themselves tell us about integration needs and shortcomings.
Thank you for that, and we'll link it as well.
Sure.
I want to wear my leader of a social service hat, and let's see. So I can be a little bit of a bull in a china shop in some regards, because where I feel most frustrated in this work is, you're like, all the things that you just spoke to, it's common sense, guys. Like economic self-sufficiency as the like leading indicator of integration is insane. Like that literally makes no sense. However, then you get this, I'm not shaming state programs, but just bear with me for this. You get all these programs who they're like, you're a social service agency and you're built to serve our newcomers. And I say, yes. And they say, but why can't you do this? And I said, well, let me tell you why. Because there's all these rules in eligibility or in terms of can they participate in these programs. So on one hand, you've got, right, like we see the issue and you see a largely unwilling sort of legislative body, both city, state, and federally, willing to do anything about it. And that's, we've been in that for, 50 years, right, of that being the issue. And for us, I think one of the things that we've really enjoyed about the coalition and sharing ideas is because we don't accept that as an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So we say, fine, we'll play within your rules, right, because we have to.
Right.
But we have to do other things because this population, if we leave them to the system, are exploited. And that is like the ugly truth of it. And it's not to say that like we shouldn't do the work we're doing. We absolutely should. And there's a ton of progress to be made. But there's also a lot of narrative out there that says there's a system that supports it. And the reality of that is it doesn't. And until we acknowledge that the system doesn't work, and then people like you in your role and what RCUSA is doing and all of these organizations, what they're really doing is filling gaps that provide basic dignity to people who deserve our best. Yeah. And sorry, I'll stop my diatribe. My question in that is it's hard. Your mentor gave great advice. It's amazing what you can get done when you don't seek the credit for it. That's hard to sell to a politician.
Yeah. Well, yeah. On the one hand, we have the system that we have. On the other hand, if we're not all actively working to improve it, it's never going to improve. And so much to say about those great points. I mean, just to go back to the housing question, we've started a series we call the Policy Center webinars, and Taif Jani of our staff is running that program. We did a great session last fall where we brought in not only the lead housing advocates and policy sort of technical assistance providers within our coalition, but we also brought in a former White House advisor on housing and the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And they, in other words, we can't resolve the housing situation from within the refugee serving field. It has to be alongside and in alignment with a much broader quest to really do something about lack of affordable, accessible housing across the country. Again, when I'm speaking of social services, I'm speaking professionally as an outsider in the sense that although a lot of our membership is deeply engaged, I don't have that professional background. I have the background of a political scientist who can look around the world at some countries who do a much better job of providing social services because they haven't gone as far over into the sort of libertarian side of the equation as this country has. And believe me, I think libertarianism is part of the bedrock of of the United States. And I'm not talking about large L political libertarianism, but just the notion of freedom and what attracts people to this country. It absolutely has to be matched with as strong a sense of solidarity, which in other countries has been provided politically by the sort of more social democratic approach to provision of social services, which is, in other words, yes, the taxes are higher, and yes, the situation's better for everyone in terms of access to housing, education, and medicine. It is absolutely imperfect in every one of those countries, and it's easy to sort of romanticize. What if the world all looked like Sweden? And I'm sure Sweden doesn't even look like Sweden. You know what I'm saying? But if we keep saying, well, no, the government needs to get out of this, the government needs to get out of that, what we're really saying is that the public needs to stop providing this, the public needs to stop providing that, and leave everyone to their own resources. And the more we go down that road, the more we get into a negative kind of libertarian death spiral that makes everyone worse off. So we need to kind of rebalance in this country. And this is going to sound political, but we need to really make public investments in things that we're asking nonprofits now to pick up the pieces, and that's utterly inadequate. There was a Chicago area professional said something a decade or more ago that stuck with me, and we're being asked, and this was in the context of state budget cuts and social services, and this was an individual who at the time worked in philanthropy, said we're being asked to basically supply what the withdrawal of the state has made into a real lack, and it's like being asked to sort of fill in a black hole, in terms of budget, because the orders of magnitude that are available through private provision of these services is inadequate. And so it's a little bit like we're talking from Chicago, where post-COVID the L, our local subway system is in deep trouble in terms of finances and ridership. People work from home; they're not commuting as such. But when I was a daily commuter in Chicago, going downtown by the Blue Line every day, I would notice that in extreme weather, snowstorms in Chicago, the ridership would go way up because people couldn't get their cars, out of the driveway and maybe out of the garage, and they people who would ride the L who never normally rode the L, and they'd take one look at this overcrowded train and think, well, the L is terrible because it's so overcrowded. And it's like, well, it's actually here every day, by the way, including on the days it's not overcrowded, and it's actually an efficient way of getting to and from. But if we sort of train ourselves to ignore things like public transit and reinforce the notion that everyone sort of needs to get to work through their own private vehicle, we're again going down that spiral. It takes us away from public investment in public goods, or in goods that everyone can have access to. So, that's a real political soapbox, and I worry about going too far down that path. But look, it's the reality of the situation that we're in, and at some point we've got to say, well, we can't keep going in this direction. It's going to just make everyone worse off to just ignore these real universal needs that are by no means being now universally supplied.
Yeah. So, John, your points reminded me of one of my former refugee interviewees for my dissertation, and he said, Ali, people are nice here, but they are not kind. Okay, so no, it tells me, I understand. It tells me that the expectation in other side of the world, people have some a set of expectation of their government.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but here, no, it seems government deter everything towards people. Okay, you take care of yourself, whatever. And last November, December 2023, I visited Germany, It was cold weather, and I was very amazed with their social system over there, and it was very rare to see some homeless people over there. And it was interesting that I heard many of times, and when people saw homeless people over there, without thinking, maybe nobody wants to be a homeless. Okay, there is a reason, there is a root, but people are saying nobody should be homeless in this country. Okay, because government take care of the
Hmm.
underserved communities a lot. It was kind of a shock for people to see the homeless people in Germany. And but my again, I don't want to issue a political statement, but I believe our government should play a kindness role for the underserved community and refugees and immigrants. So let's get back to our main questions now.
Mm.
So in your advocacy role, now you are in our podcast, our stories podcast. And I remember last year we were discussing why we should start our stories podcast.
Mm.
Okay? And you tell us about the role of storytelling and why we should change the narrative.
Yeah, no, first of all, I mean, there's a few things that come to mind when you ask that question, and the very first thing that comes to mind is I'm a policy wonk, and I'm not a storytelling specialist. So I I can tell you my personal stories, but I treasure the skills of the folks in our coalition who are focusing specifically on the storytelling aspect. There's a refugee storytellers collective. There are in I know the state of Colorado, for instance, has a refugee speakers bureau. I don't know how widely that's replicated, but that's an idea that is probably deserving of wider replication. Obviously, the personal stories are what resonate. If you stop seeing a refugee or a migrant as an abstraction and start seeing them as a human being, as a neighbor, a friend, a family member, a coworker, and if you spend time with them, and a story is a way of I think in some ways of temporarily bridging the gap that you talked about at the very outset between being a bystander and an ally. It's a support to bring you away from a bystander, maybe news fatigue with a particular topic, and to jolt you back into the realization of that's a human being, you're a human being. And the next step, though, I think has to be to act on the story and to live out some of the values that the story sort of reawakens or reminds you of. So that's why, for instance, in our field right now, there's such a big push for community sponsorship and private sponsorship of refugees. It's a challenge in some ways to the system because of the way it interfaces with the traditional resettlement program, which has been a very much an iterative, negotiated process still underway. But the basic idea behind it, I think, is extremely sound, and that is, if you know someone who's a refugee, you're capable of coming much further along in that journey from bystander to ally. And the example that's always spoken of is Canada, where so many Syrian refugees were welcomed by Canada in 2015, 2016, that the factoid that's always shared is that something like 1/3 of the Canadian population either had met a refugee themselves or knew someone who had. And that, what a social scientist would refer to as contact theory of sort of normalization of the idea of refugees are human beings that are deserving of the same thing as everyone else, is something that I think the move toward community and private sponsorship really relies on and is sort of grounded in. And so once again, I think I've probably lost track of your initial question, but hopefully
I think, and I do want to, because you alluded to something, and I want to make sure we sort of, at least from my vantage point, put a bow on this. That it's easy to point the finger. I'm right there with you to point the finger at the system, the government's efficiency and ineffectiveness. But I think there's also, that's only half the story. I think the other part is to remind, myself and folks that are listening, that is, as much as you want to blame a bad policy or politician or a system, I think you give yourself a second to look in the mirror and say, where is my responsibility in this? We are not talking about immigration issues. We are talking about human rights. Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
And when you sit with that, I think if your response is, and this is my response in a lot of cases, and it's my own growth I have to do, well, isn't the government supposed to do something about that? Or whatever? I just challenged to lean a little bit in, reach out, ask somebody. And how can you, and it doesn't have to be a financial contribution. That would be great. It could be as simple as we said in our first episode, just try to get to know meet someone.
Yeah.
Just your one or two conversations. If you live in Chicago or the metropolitan area, you are one or two conversations away from connecting to someone who can open your eyes to these experiences. And so I think, while I'm not minimizing the role of refining and improving the system, I think we have to underscore the importance of our own responsibility to work each day that we can to just build community. And community is not a homogenous thing. And I think that is where I think we're striving to be, because the stories do a beautiful job of humanizing things and sort of stepping into that sort of gap that exists when you're moving from bystander to ally. But I think if that's where it ends, you hear the stories and you receive them, but you don't do anything about it, I would just encourage us to say, don't end it with blaming the government or blaming a politician. Look and think, how can we engage?
I 100% agree with you. Yeah. The personal individual responsibility matters. And because it doesn't matter now at this point we blame government or not. Okay, we need to survive somehow. We need to support each other. I'm glad you mentioned private sponsorship. So Chris, to your point, could you please tell our audience about the private sponsorship model and Welcome Corps? And if they are interested, they can reach out to us. We can explain to them more.
You just did.
No, but
you did it beautifully. You did it beautifully. Email Ali if you want to know more. No, it's beautiful. So here's the opportunity in very simple terms, right? This is a remarkable program that sort of opened up the opportunity to engage and welcome refugees into the country. And we understand that can seem daunting and seem like a very overwhelming process. So what the government did, and I think it's a sound program, is they said, hey, there may be groups who are saying, I want to do more. I would love to support and move the needle and really be an ally and a sponsor for a family. They said, it's wonderful. There's a place to do that. And there's private sponsor organizations. There's organizations who work in this field that are here to support you. And so Trellis is proud to be one of those private sponsor organizations. And so I think if anyone's listening to this and you're saying, how might I do more? Or this is great. I've really wanted to know, I've got extra space or a motivated group of friends, reach out to us. And there's very much a mechanism by way we can support and help you do that.
Great. Yeah. Can I go back to a couple of points that were made earlier? One on the expectations that you encountered in Germany that the government should take care of this and that. And I hear that a lot from people who come to this country from Europe, right? An expectation that, well, actually in the Netherlands, housing is a human right. Oh, really? Okay. Well, we really don't talk about it that way in this country. And, but Chris, what you said about the sort of the people-centeredness, for me, it doesn't move us a lot to say, well, the government should take care of this. I think people should be taking care of this, and to separate the notion of government from people. To me, COVID was a big example of other models that have to supplement the notion that, it's all about government provision. It's really, COVID brought up a mutual aid model of how we take care of each other, and where we were looking after those whose health was compromised, that the older adult who might live on our block. We were looking after each other in provisioning, and particularly for the most vulnerable communities, they've always had to look after each other, right? And I think COVID, if we had taken the time to more thoughtfully digest some of the lessons, I think the filling in of the spectrum from you're on your own, go out to the marketplace, satisfy your needs that way, and through taxation, the government will provide these services, is that there needs to be a rich, and philanthropy is part of that, but we can't rely 100% on philanthropy for this. I think the kind of mutual aid is also part of it, but building that into the way people are able to live their lives, so that we're able to help take care of each other, building in the notion of a care economy into how we look at our system. And then finally, government, like other institutions, so much of the time we point our fingers at government, we should be pointing our fingers at some of the large corporations that are shaping our world. And whether it's a corporation or whether it's a government, it's people. And if our systems only kind of reinforce the power of people with the most resources, whether it's a government policy or the way our corporate landscape is arrayed, we need to think of ways of empowering people to have more control over their own lives and more life opportunities, and through whichever means of providing that we can. But to sort of put a social service agency at the end of the road and say, everything we've failed to take care of in this society is going to be on you, and by the way, you're underfunded, and good luck. Mm-hmm. Then we get into some of this, the issues that each of you are much more familiar with in terms of your day-to-day work than I am, of how the limitations on what you're able to achieve, despite the fact that you're working extraordinarily long hours to get the work done.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that. And I'd be interested as we sort of look and at RCUSA and sort of representing just a wide sort of array of organizations and all 10 national resettlement agencies. If you could look at just in your tenure at RCUSA, and you could distill it down to, here is something I wish I would have known going into it.
Well, a couple of things. I want to kind of take it back to like things I wish I'd known 20 years ago when I first started working in the migration field. And that is that we're all in it together. And I think the refugee serving organizations nationally and in the way they spoke about their work have undergone a very healthy evolution, which is a journey that I had to also, take, between thinking of people through their legal status and thinking of people as humans with needs. So for a long time, I think resettled refugees were not given the kind of advocacy attention, and refugee resettlement wasn't, because it was considered to be a program for which there was bipartisan support in Congress. So although we had a very powerful immigrant rights movement in this country, it's taken a long time, and we're still not all the way there, between understanding that newcomers, through whichever pathway they've come, have needs, and we can't throw one population under the bus in advocating for another. And it's really tricky, particularly in a very contentious political environment. And so if I had come in to my position understanding that really acting on an understanding that we can't help refugees by only speaking out for refugees. I'm going to get very topical because we're taping this the morning after the first presidential debate. And by the time this airs, I have no idea where things are going to stand in that particular contest. But we've moved, in terms of public discourse on migrants, into a very dangerous space where from concerted efforts to associate the notion of immigrant with the concept of illegality, we've jumped over to, this phrase, migrant crime, which is so demonizing and so scapegoating and so dehumanizing and so distorting of reality that to me, that's a 5-alarm fire in terms of where we're going with public discourse. And to think that somehow we can continue to sort of resettle refugees and carry out that work when so many of the agencies that do this work are at the same time trying to help populations that didn't come as refugees, may or may not have come through a humanitarian pathway. But I think all of those populations are getting thrown under the bus by our politicians who want to say they're the problem. Mm-hmm. Whereas you invited a political scientist on and you got a lot of critique of political economy earlier in this conversation. The systems are not working as they should be for a lot of people. The refugees who come in with such specific needs, with a program that provides some but very limited financial support for them and other types of supports that do come through the state, many of them with federal funding. We can't only focus on that. So it's tough because but I think it's continuing to serve and advocate for refugees while understanding that at the same time you're in an environment where we frankly just need to normalize the notion that people move from country to country, mm-hmm. and not just people who can afford to fly business class.
And I want to, I know we've got a few minutes. I want to sort of tell a very abbreviated story. This is personal to me, and I want to sort of talk about what you just said. I mean, we saw it last night, right? Or we saw it on June 27th. Mm-hmm. The narrative around the immigration issue is awful. Like it is in more and more dehumanizing all the things you just said. It is really, really concerning what you see from the political elites. And I think one of the things that's hard when people hear that, they associate, well, these people are in positions of power and influence. Surely they have a read on what's best for national security or whatever. And I think, one, that's a fallacy at best. But I think this story, and this is personal to me, it's family members, but you hear this thing, we hear it thrown out all the time, illegals, right? And even my own family meets that definition. Mm-hmm. And just understand that it's like, hey, one, understand why people leave. Like first, just try and give yourself a little bit of time and just say, why would someone, in this case, fly into Canada, sneak into the back of a box truck and go from Toronto to Detroit and drive over to Chicago? Why would someone do that in from a European country? And you start to understand, well, maybe because they just spent the past 6 months eating only potatoes and water and rationing things like milk and eggs. And there's this idea that they're here to take the riches of America. Mm-hmm. And then when you get up close and personal with it, please understand the other side of this too, though, that same group has been in the shadows, in this case, for the past 24 years. And I think what we owe, if there's any American ideal that we stand on, is the ideal of freedom and opportunity and that people are deserving of that. Not that we're going to give it away, but access to it. And I think when we minimize or oversimplify these issues, that there's limited English supports, and just really quick on this topic of where I think the public narrative is shifting, and we want to sort of every way we can help humanize this, is because I have never once in my life and met someone who is in any type of immigrant, refugee, forcibly displaced person who is here and their motive is to take or do any. All they're asking for is dignity, and that is it. And it's not really more. I'm not trying to oversimplify, and I'll turn it over to you, Ali. The issues, but it really just is a basic dignity that we afford people. And if that's what we're chasing, I think we should all be able to rally behind that and not politicize it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you. And I just wanted to mention that, the challenges are very complex. And unfortunately, our decision makers, our politicians, pick one issue and punish all. So let me tell you an example. So we have southern border crisis. I understand. I understand if even they have the security, safety issues, whatever. Okay, whatever they are talking about it, I get it. But what happened in the previous administration? They closed the doors to refugees who have been in the line, okay, in the pipeline for years, 10 years, 17 years, and it's good for our audience to know any refugee who arrived here through the State Department, okay, and they highly screen, their background highly screen, and they always make a joke, no, the refugees background check process is the same as the president of the United States. It's that complicated, the long process. And what we saw, okay, the former president, okay, just with one signature, closed the doors to all those refugees who have been waiting in the pipeline to arrive here. And again, for our audience, you should know that every September, the President of the United States signed an executive order and determined the refugee admission number. And every single refugee who arrive here, they pay for their tickets, the flight tickets. Okay, it's not free. Okay, it means we have to pay it back. So nothing is free in this country. But who got punished because of the government has some challenges somewhere else. Okay, they closed all doors to the majority of the population. So yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I want to do this. I know we're coming up on
yeah, so you should wrap up.
I want to take us and start with myself, because it is the challenges are immense and they're complicated, and it can be stifling and overwhelming and all of those things. But I think if we can spend the last 5 or 10 minutes and look, offer some hope. And where we see things that are really optimistic. We talked about the Welcome Corps. We talked about the work of RCUSA. And I think, I'll answer my own question and then I'll pass it to you, John, is I've never been more hopeful in terms of what we're able to accomplish as a city, as a community, as a country. And I believe that is because even though ripe with challenge and problems, the resolve of the human spirit is incredibly strong. And I think you've we spent some time talking about the narrative, but I think on the flip side of a sort of political pressure to marginalize communities, you actually see the reinforcement of connection and interdependence. And I think that's what gives me most hope, is that we have people from all backgrounds and different disciplines talking about how do we come together, because it's only through our interconnectedness that we will support and I think bring about some of the changes that I think we're all seeking. So that gives me a ton a ton of hope as we look to the future. John?
Sources of hope. I think most people around the world want to help others. I really do. And I think when people find themselves stressed, that may or may not get in the way of their willingness to help others because people in some of the most dire circumstances are out there helping each other. And so for us in a country which is, on the aggregate, by any measure, extraordinarily wealthy, we not only have a moral obligation, we actually have the material means to accomplish this basic human task of helping others and do it at a level and at a scale that is needed to make a real difference.
John, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. And as always, Ali, it's a pleasure to sit across from you. We covered a lot. We covered, the work of RCUSA and just the challenges and opportunities. And I hope that as we engage this conversation, there may be more questions, there may be concerns. Feel free and contact us. You can see those things on our website, rstoriespodcast.com. And John, I would like to just offer, I know folks are probably listening or watching and say, you know what, I want to hear more about John and the work of RCUSA. So how can they reach you, follow along in your journey?
Well, the very simplest way to do so is to visit our website, www.rcusa.org. And we also have an email line, info@rcusa.org. Ours is a vibrant, diverse, growing, dynamic coalition. Every month there are new challenges and new opportunities for us to try to improve the lives of refugees. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the invitation today.
Thanks for tuning in to Our Stories and joining the conversation. To learn more about the podcast or get in touch, you can visit us at rstoriespodcast.com or find us on social media. Our Stories is recorded in Chicago and co-produced by Trellis and Flex Tech AI. We'll see you next time.